Hello everyone, nice to speak with you today. So today I'll be doing a presentation on speech, language and literacy support for neurodivergent pupils. Just to begin, I'll just give a little bit of a background about myself. So I qualified as a speech and language therapist in 2019 at Plymouth Marjon University. Then from 2019 to 2022, I worked within an NHS community speech and language therapy service in Wiltshire, where I work with a range of different pupils, those who are neurotypical and those who are neurodivergent as well. And then in 2022, I specialised as a speech and language therapist and became an autism practitioner and worked across 2 sister services and carrying out autism assessment for children from the age of 2 up to 18, where I was diagnosing children with autism and also later on ADHD as well. And that was also in Wiltshire. And then in June last year, I joined the Witherslack group and I've really enjoyed working here so far. So the aims of today's session are to develop an understanding of neurodiversity, to develop an understanding of what speech and language therapy is, to develop an understanding of how speech, language and literacy development are linked together, the importance of phonological awareness to develop a child's reading potential, and to learn practical strategies and approaches to support children with their speech, language and literacy development. So I hope you enjoy today's session. So first of all, I just wanted to touch on some neurodiversity terminology, which you may or may not already be aware of. So someone might say, oh, they're neurodiverse, when actually, no, they're neurodivergent. So there's always a debate about the different terminology. So when we think about neurodiversity, this is all about a difference, a variation, and a range of different skills and strengths. And neurodiversity highlights the idea that there's no one right way to think, learn, behave, or feel. And neurodiversity is used to describe many different and varied ways that the human brain works. So neuro, meaning brain, and diversity means differences, just that there are lots of brain differences within our community. And then we've got the term neurotypical. So again, neuro meaning brain, and typical, the most common. So within this group of people from the picture, those who are blue, they are the most common brains within that community because they all have the same type of brain. Where then we've got some yellow, people who are yellow or people who are red, and they might have different types of brain, whether that could be autism, whether that could be ADHD or dyslexia. But neurotypical means the most common brain. And then we've got the term neurodivergent. So neuro meaning brain, but divergent meaning it differs from the most. So we can say there is neurodiversity, but when we're talking about a specific person, we would say that they are neurodivergent. Say, for example, if they've got autism or if they've got ADHD or dyslexia or other neurodivergences. Okay, so in this diagram here, yes, you've got all the blue people, which we would say in the previous picture were neurotypical, but the red and the yellow people here are neurodivergent because their brains differ from the most common within this community, as shown in the picture. And there are many neurodivergences, including autism. This diagram just shows a few. So from ADHD to autism to some sensory processing disorders, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, and some mental health conditions as well, such as schizophrenia, and also some genetic conditions like Down syndrome as well. And neurodivergent people are likely to have they're more than likely to have one or more additional neurodivergences, such as dyspraxia, dyslexia, or Tourette's. So it's just something to be aware of when we're working with different pupils in schools. So we're going to just touch on what is speech and language therapy. So Speech and language therapists, we work with a range of people of all ages and at all stages of life. And this can be from newborn babies in neonatal care to elderly people receiving end-of-life care. And typically, we provide assessment and treatment in two key areas. And these two key areas are communication and also dysphagia. So dysphagia is all about the swallowing, so eating, drinking and swallowing and the way the muscles work. So this is not what we'll be focusing on today, but it's just something for you to be aware of in case you notice any eating or drinking or swallowing difficulties in pupils at your schools, so you can refer to the NHS or other services for support with possible eating, drinking and swallowing difficulties. So as a speech and language therapist, like I mentioned, today's focus will be on the communication side. And I just wanted to touch on the different areas that we support as speech and language therapists. So we can work on speech, and this refers to the speech sound and the physical production of those speech sounds. So a bit more cats, breaking it down into the three individual sounds, the k, the a, and the t. And you'll just notice we will write them slightly differently to how we would write them if we were in a spelling test. That's just the way speech and language therapists record things. And we also look at language, which is looking at the use, so the expressive use of language, but also receptive, so the understanding of language. And when we also look at the vocabulary and the meaning of words, we look at word order, sentence structure, and the rules of grammar also. And then we also look at social interactions, and this is looking at the different communication style, social communication styles that might be. So this might be preferences around eye contact, as we see some neurodivergent children, whether they've got autism or ADHD, may not like to use eye contact. So just something to be aware of. The ability to perspective take, so being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes to kind of figure out, oh, how might be feeling in a certain situation, or how they may respond differently to you in a different situation. Also looking at self-advocacy skills, being able to make and maintain friendships, understanding contextual clues, and also expectations within that social situation. So this is just a brief overview of what we look at, and we can support as speech and language therapists for children and also adults when they're older as well. So at your school, I just want you to think about what is the main area you may struggle to support with speech, language and literacy. And if you want to put a note in the comments, that would be really helpful to know. And then we can talk about this during the Q&A later on. I'll just give you a minute to do that. And if it's not something we
in the chat, Amy, already, just saying receptive understanding, communication of emotions, ASD making friendships and perspective taking, stammering, comprehension, spoken language, especially since COVID, emotions. There's loads coming in.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful to know. And I know we'll specifically touch on like the speech, language and literacy during today's session. But if there's any other questions that are maybe not specific on this topic, but you've mentioned it, especially in relation to the autism, making friends, the emotional literacy and stammering, I'm more than happy to answer your questions at the end of the session. Just it'll be helpful just to know which areas you may struggle with at the moment. Okay, so I'll go through some of the strategies we can then now use to support speech, language and literacy. So speech, language and literacy are interconnected with strong speech and language skills forming the foundation for literacy development, including reading and writing. So speech, the ability to speak and produce sounds, is crucial skills needed to develop language skills. As then the children develop their speech, they also learn to understand and use language, which is vital for literacy. And then literacy, including reading and writing, is dependent on a strong foundation of language skills. So an individual's ability to understand and use language to express themselves through spoken language is a key factor in predicting later literacy achievement. Okay, so the areas we'll be looking at today, we'll be looking at phonological awareness, vocabulary development, sentence structure and grammar, comprehension, and narrative skills. And that seems like quite a lot, but it'll be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. If you have any questions about any of these areas, I'm more than happy to answer them later on and suggest the different strategies as well. So, what is phonological awareness? Some of you may already be aware of what this is. So, we as speech and language therapists can help with phonological awareness, which is sound awareness, and this is a prerequisite skill for literacy development. And phonological awareness involves a child's ability to recognise and generate rhyme, to manipulate sounds, so blending them, segmenting and deleting sounds, to segment words into their syllables, so to break them down, like banana, we'll go banana, three separate sections for that word, and then also to identify the first, middle and last sounds in a word. And this is a really crucial skill that then will be later brought on when you go into phonics and later literacy development as well. And the term phonological awareness is an umbrella term which represents a continuum of skills that develop over time. And phonemic awareness also falls under this umbrella term of phonological awareness. And phonological awareness can be divided into 3 sections, from the early, basic, advanced, with basic and advanced representing phonemic awareness at the highest phonological awareness levels. So this diagram just shows you that the least complex skill within phonological awareness is words containing syllables. So identifying those syllables, and then moving on to rhyme and alliteration, onset rhyme, segmenting, blending sounds into words, segmenting words into sounds, and deleting, substituting, and reversing phonemes as well. Okay. So the importance of phonological awareness for literacy skills. So explicit knowledge of phonological structure of words allows a child to make connections between the spoken form of a word and its written representation. And phonological awareness is recognised as a crucial skill for learning to read alphabetic languages. And research suggests there is a strong link between phonological awareness skills and a child's potential reading development. So consequently, the UK's National Curriculum's literacy strategy currently focuses on phonological awareness skills in the development of children's reading and writing. And there is evidence that suggests that a few hours of phonological awareness training can increase a child's readiness to read by up to 2 years. So just in relation to the first point I made, a child with a weaker phonological awareness will struggle with reading. So when we read, we're focused on identifying the words in front of us. We also need to keep track of the words we just read and grab the meaning from previous and future words we might encounter. So this is a lot to stay on top of. So by having good phonological awareness skills, we can focus more on the comprehension of the text we read and less on struggling to decode what a word says. So a child who has a poorly developed phonological awareness, so their awareness of and to access the sound structure of their language, will have more difficulty reading than a child with a well-developed phonological awareness. And before children are even ready to read, write, or spell, they develop phonological awareness skills. And these help them to understand how words contain sounds and how these sounds are represented by letters. And these are the critical skills needed for reading. And we can find difficulties with this for those children, especially who have speech sound disorders, where they might replace sounds with other sounds that don't necessarily follow the typical pattern of development for speech sounds. And I just wanted to show you this intervention. So this is called the Newcastle Intervention for Phonological Awareness. Shorter name is NIPA. There is also the NAPA, which is the Newcastle Assessment for Phonological Awareness. And this is a programme that was put together by Helen Stringer by Newcastle University. And it can be used with individual children or with groups of children as a targeted intervention. It's not currently recommended as a whole class or universal intervention, just because for optimal benefit, it's essential to progress at the right pace for each individual child. And why I wanted to show you this is just because this programme was originally developed for the use by speech and language therapists to use for children with speech sound disorders. However, now it is widely used by teachers in early years settings and older children who are struggling with reading and spelling. So this is an intervention that can be completed by teachers, by SENCOs, by teaching assistants, by higher level teaching assistants, and all to support the children's phonological awareness skills and to support them if they are struggling with reading and writing. And parents, guardians and carers and other family members are encouraged to deliver phonological awareness activities and take part in sessions with support or guidance either from speech and language therapists or teachers and TAs. So this, I've included the link up here, so it's definitely worth going on to, and I'm sure these slides will be shared at the end. And there are they're starting to introduce training videos about how to use the resources. But they've got all of the pictures needed, and you can download the intervention packs and it tells you what step to do. So it's a really good programme that we recommend everyone to use to support the children. And this programme includes information about phonological awareness, how it develops and why it is important, guidance for the delivery of the intervention and how to integrate it into teaching, like for those children who are bilingual, and how to talk to the children and how to use the stimulus words. And it will also give guidance on starting points and progression through the programme. And the whole programme includes 11 session plans, and they're all pre-planned, so you just have to pick up the plan and the resources and deliver them to the children. So it's all there ready for you, because I understand time pressures working in schools to be able to create all the resources you need. So this is all prepared for you, which is great. And these session plans will take you through the sequence of phonological awareness skills. So if you know that a child can already do the first stage, you can always go on to the next one, and it will show you about different starting points based on what skills you already know the children or child in particular that you're thinking about, where they should be starting for the next part of the programme. So strategies to support phonological awareness and also just generally speech sound awareness. We always say to try and reduce background noises and environmental distractions. For example, people walking past outside the classroom, any noises from external, from outside the school or maybe next classrooms next door. Trying to speak clearly and not too fast. To sit at the same level as a child so they can clearly see your face, by encouraging them to look at your face when you're talking. So as you're modelling the different speech sounds, they can see you. However, this point is really important to consider, especially when you're working with neurodivergent pupils, because as part of their profile, whether that's being autistic, having ADHD, or any other neurodivergent condition they have, they may show preference for using minimal eye contact, or they may not like to talk to you or so look at you when you are speaking to them. So it might be best, rather than sitting next to them side by side or sitting opposite them, sit at a right angle to them so they can still see your face, but it might take the pressure off them because they don't necessarily have to look at you directly. They can still see how you're modelling speech sound strategies, how you're modelling those speech sounds to them, but it just takes that pressure and it might make them feel more comfortable during your sessions with them. So it's just something to be aware of, especially when we're working with neurodivergent pupils. And you can always ask them, because they're sometimes very open to sharing how they feel about eye contact, or, well, actually, would you prefer me to sit on the other side of the table, or would you prefer me to sit in a certain direction to help? So the next one, so playing sound games with the children. So like I spy, finding things around the house, at school, that begin with that certain sound. Practicing clapping out the syllables. So, for example, dog is 1 clap, but as I mentioned, banana is 3 claps of banana. You're separating it into 3 claps, and this is an activity that you can put into any lesson for certainly in primary school, but also later on in secondary school as well, by breaking down the claps and also breaking down the words into their claps to recognise the beats in those words. And that was always good, and it helps children to actually learn how to say the words as well. So not only learning to say the words, but it's a fun way to remember those words and store them. And we'll touch on vocabulary in a little second as well. If you're having difficulty understanding what the child says, see if they can tell you in another way by showing you what it is, miming it out, maybe having a little bit like a game of charades, using actions or gesture, or just drawing what it is they're trying to tell you. Because if we continually ask them to repeat the word, this may cause them to become quite self-conscious. They may become really upset. Or some of them actually are more than happy to repeat words over and over again. And I'm sure within schools you've seen a range of different children, how they respond. But it's just another strategy just to help children if you're not fully understanding what they're saying, and to reduce the risk of possible frustration as well. For children whose speech is very unintelligible, so very unclear, and you're really struggling to speak, to understand what they're saying when they're speaking, it may be helpful to have a book with pictures of important words. So some people might just, some SALTs might refer to these as a core vocabulary word book or a keyword book. There's different terminology used, but it might have a book with important pictures so they can point to the word that they may not be able to verbally express and say to you, so you then know what they're trying to express, and it's just a different way for them to be able to communicate with you. Okay. And if a child makes errors when they're talking, it's important to repeat the word back to them, showing them the correct way to say it. So rather than saying, no, that's not right, it's this way, just say, yes, you said. So for example, the bottom I've said here, a child says a tat or cat. You would say, yes, it is a cat. And then trying to use the words a few times in a few sentences after this, with putting slight emphasis on the correct sound that they did find difficult to say, is really helpful, because then they're hearing, yes, it is a cat, it's a black cat, and the cat is drinking. So that's 3 clear models of the sounds that they're struggling to say, because the more they hear the correct sounds being modelled to them by adults, at school, by their peers, even by parents at home, the more likely they are then to hear to store that correct version of how to say the sound, and eventually, with support from speech and language therapists, from teachers and teaching assistants, they hopefully then will be able to progress to say the sounds that they are struggling to say. So we're going to move on to vocabulary. So vocabulary. Vocabulary is the strongest predictor of reading. When a child sees a written word for the first time, they are more likely to read it correctly if they have heard the word before. And as the age increases, the role of word decoding as a predictor of reading comprehension decreases, and the role of listening comprehension increases. So children with poor vocabulary do really well with reading up until about 8 years old, and then there is a drop rapidly as they do not then have the vocabulary to continue to progress with their reading skills. So the vocabulary is such an important skill that we need to support children with, just to be able to support their literacy and their reading development as they progress through school. And semantic skills, so the word meaning, are also important in helping a child to understand and use phrases and longer sentences appropriately. Sometimes a child may retain a whole phrase that someone said, but they're unaware of its meaning. But for that reason, they then may use the word inappropriately. And another child may possess many words and have a really strong vocabulary, but they struggle to understand and use the words appropriately. Or a child may have very few words, but is secure in the understanding of what those words mean and using them appropriately. So sometimes we might say, oh, a child has a lot of vocabulary. They're using vocabulary, but they're not always using the words correctly. And that might just be that they haven't got a secure semantic frame for that word. So they'll have heard the word, they're just not using it appropriately because they don't understand that meaning. That's why understanding the meaning of words is so important. So this is all these different situations may cause difficulty with a child successfully expressing themselves. So that's why vocabulary is really important. And approach that you may be aware of in some of your schools. If not, I definitely recommend getting on board with WordAware. So it was developed by Stephen Parsons and Anna Brannigan, and it's a structured whole school approach to support vocabulary development of all children. And it looks at different strategies to help support vocabulary development. And the main one that I wanted to show you today, these are 6 areas which are really good that we can all use to support children to learn new words. So firstly, looking at what does it mean, whether this is looking at a dictionary, if you have iPads, going onto an online dictionary. What is the first sound in the word? So obviously this is recognising, going back to what we said about phonological skills, phonological awareness skills, recognising the first and the last sound. So firstly, what does it mean? What is the first sound and can we say that first sound? Act out the word. So have a little bit of a game, like can you act out the word and can other people guess what the word is you're trying to mime? Using the word in a sentence and clapping the syllables, so breaking down the word into its beats to help with another way to remember the word. And then finally, how will you remember the word? So I like to think of it, put a personal experience into the word. So if the word is, say, let's think of a word. If we're trying to learn, if we're thinking of a vocabulary category, we're thinking, should have thought of it all before this, but I'm I hear myself. Let's think of the word, we're just going to go with carrot. Okay, so if we looked at the word, we would find out that the word carrot is a vegetable and we can eat it. So we want to be able to say the first sound. So the first sound is ka. So that's the first one. We act out the word. So we might act out maybe making a snowman and putting the carrot for the snowman's nose. Then we might use the word in a sentence. Oh, I built a snowman and I use a carrot for the snowman's nose. Or it might be a simpler or more complex sentence. Then we would clap out the syllables, so carrot. And then we think, well, what's a personal experience? Because the more personal it is, the more likely to remember it. So how will I remember the word carrot? So, well, I really like making cake and I really enjoy making carrot cake. So that is how I'm going to remember the word. So by using these strategies, it really helps us to make those links, which are so important to help us learn new words. And I like to use the analogy of kerplunk, which is a game you might have in your schools. So if you imagine you're playing kerplunk, and all the sticks are in their places and they're stopping the marbles from falling down. So as we start to remove the sticks, we'll find there are gaps and the marbles will then fall. So I like to use this analogy for vocabulary because without all of these links, which I'm using as representation for the sticks, so finding out the meaning of the word, the first and last sound, clapping out the syllables, think of how we will remember it through a personal link. A child or young person will not be able to learn the new vocabulary because the marbles are falling through the gaps, meaning the child can't then store the new vocabulary they are learning in their long-term memory. So later on when they're asked, oh, what was that word again, that new word we were learning in science, they won't be able to retrieve it because they haven't gone through each of the stages to be able to store it in their long-term memory and put it in the whatever lesson scheme they've got in their head. So it's just something to be important to be aware of. And the more links we have, the more ways we think of how to learn the word, the more likely the word will be stored in the long-term memory, and the child will be able to learn new words, which in turn will help them later on in the development of their literacy skills, because they'll be able to recognise the word, they'll know what it means, and then they can just continue to, with their reading, and then, like we mentioned earlier, focus on the comprehension of the text rather than just the figuring out, oh, what's that word mean? I need to go and find out what that word means. Okay. And yeah, without the links, the marbles will all fall down, and we'll lose that vocabulary because we haven't been able to store it in our long term. Okay, so just some strategies to help us with our vocabulary development. So try to reduce background noises, environmental distractions, as we mentioned earlier. Identifying key words for the topic and introduce these at the beginning of the topic lessons. Consider pre-teaching the key vocabulary for the subject, whether this is through one-to-one support in school as kind of an introduction to a topic. So we're going to learn these new words, and then say after the Easter holidays, come back to school, this will be the new topic within that lesson. And also we can encourage parents to carry out pre-learning of the vocabulary at home. And understand there may be barriers to that section, especially if we're working with bilingual children and their families may not understand the words themselves. So it's just different ways we can try to support children with the pre-teaching of vocabulary. And pre-teaching of the vocabulary at home helps children to become more familiar with the sounds and the meaning of the words in order then to access the words in the topic within the classroom. Teaching vocabulary words in context using real items as much as possible can be helpful. When working with younger children, they may benefit from having opportunities to role play and use keywords. Adults to model using key vocabulary within different contexts. And using display boards for topic words and referring to this during the lessons, and getting the children involved in making the displays, sorting words into different categories is another really important skill when we're thinking about learning words. Like, what category does that word belong to? So if we think about categories like for food, so we've got fruit and we've got vegetable, which category does carrot belong to? It belongs to the vegetable category. So they're just simple vocabulary activities as well. So we'll move on to sentence structure and grammar. So sentence structure and grammar. So those children who have difficulties with word order or sentence structure can have difficulties being understood by others, as the words in their sentences are mixed up or do not flow. So for a sentence to be complete, it must express a thought and contain a subject, a verb, and an object. And as a sentence becomes more complex and increases in words, the pattern will still remain the same. So for a subject, I like to think of who is the main person within the sentence. So I'm thinking of the sentence, the boy ate an apple. The subject of that sentence would be the boy. The verb would be ate or is eating, depending on which tense you are, say the sentence, whether the boy is eating an apple or the boy ate an apple. The is eating or ate would still be the verb, even if we then consider that is the auxiliary verb. And then we've got the object, which is, well, what is being eaten? That is the apple. Okay, so as the sentences become more complex, the subject will always come before the verb, and the verb will always come before the object. So it's just something to be aware of. And sentence structure is important in a child's writing as well as their talking, as it allows them to become more fluent in their expression. And a child who has difficulty with sentence structure might speak in single words and struggle to express their thoughts fully. And if a child speaks in single words, it can impact their conversational skills, overall communication, and their ability to write if they're struggling to express themselves as well. And difficulties with sentence structure and grammar can impact a child's ability to be able to give a narrative, talk about what they've done at the weekend, or create a story. Incorrect word order causing misinterpretation from others. They may miss out words in sentences, and those words may actually hold the most meaning within that sentence. They might struggle to form complex sentences. They may prefer to speak in short, simple sentences. or talk in single words, and they will have difficulties with their literacy skills as well. And this is an approach which is, I know, widely used by speech and language therapists, so you may or may not be aware of it within your schools, but colourful semantics, it was designed by Alison Bryan, and it's an approach used to support children developing their understanding of sentence structure, which we can also call syntax, and expand the length of their sentences. And the structure of a sentence, syntax, is colour-coded, and then these are linked to the meanings of the word, so the semantics, and hence the name colourful semantics. And when we're using these approaches, especially with neurodivergent children, some of those who may be autistic may prefer to use this because it's colour-coded and it's very structured. And as part of their autistic profile, they may prefer structure and colour coding, colour sorting. So this may be a perfect example of an approach to use with an autistic child, but it's also important to talk to them about actually what do they prefer? Do they like this, or would they prefer to learn it in a different way, like with real life pictures of maybe them in the classroom doing different activities to help them expand their sentences? So it's just something to be aware of. And another approach which some people will then move on to from colour coding, colourful semantics, is shape coding. So this is an approach developed by Susan Ebbels, and it's been used successfully to teach school-age children the following aspects of grammar. So part of speech, questions, past and present tense, noun, verb, agreement, verb, argument structures, passive or active sentences, data sentences, embedded structures and conjunctions. And if you type in shape coding onto Google, you'll find Susan Ebbels' page, and you can there's training that you can access. And it's really good for those children who need a visual way to support them to learn grammar. And this is just an example to show the different shapes and colours put together, used to help children develop their grammar using different sentence structures, grammar structures. So some strategies to support vocabulary development. So again, sentence structure. So considering the teaching environment, reduce background noise, modelling language, repeat language used to give pupils and students the opportunity to listen to the language used again and help them to process the language. So just like with speech, the more we repeat the words and say the words with the correct sounds to them, the more likely they are to store the correct version of how they should be saying the word. And it's just the same for language. The more we model correct language of sentence structures, of grammar structures, this will really support the children to process the language and have correct stores of how they should be saying that sentence, as well as support from a speech and language therapist, and also from one-to-one intervention, whether it's with a TA, with the SENCO, with the teaching, the HLTA as well. And for example, if a child makes a sentence that is grammatically incorrect, modelling the sentence back in its correct form will really help them to hear the correct one, the correct version of how they should be saying it. And it puts less pressure on by saying, no, that's not right, you need to say it like this. It's a more positive way of helping them, but without actually the children realising that you are helping them, you're just repeating the language correctly back to them. So repeating and rephrasing when necessary, as we mentioned. Giving pupils time to plan verbal responses to questions and class discussions. So this also links into the comprehension, which we will move on to very shortly. But this helping them to verbally plan, or like write, whether it's writing it down or drawing, or being able to put keywords to help them then to verbally express what they want to say, can be really helpful. Okay, so I'm just going to move on to comprehension. So comprehension is an adult says something and the child understands what the adult is saying. So something, it's cold today, you need to put your jumper on. What drink would you like? They haven't fully understood what the original comment was. They've just said something different. So this has shown an example where the child hasn't understood what the adult has said. Okay. So what can disrupt this communication pathway? So it can be, what can disrupt the communication pathway which stops a child from understanding what an adult says to them? So it could be they didn't have The adult didn't have their attention. There was sensory or environmental distractions, noises coming from the neighbouring classrooms, people walking by the window, maybe a scratchy school jumper, because sometimes the uniforms we provide to schools aren't always the most friendly for autism friendly, and they might really struggle with that. So it's just something to be aware of. There can be lots of ways. It might not just be that they didn't understand what was said, that they don't have the capacity to understand what it might just be a different distraction, whether it's sensory or environmental as well. Not enough processing time for the child to understand what the adult has said before the adult then goes and says something else, which resets their processing time clock. Too many instructions given all at once, maybe breaking them down into smaller chunks may be more helpful. They don't understand the vocabulary, or they haven't heard the word before, so that stops the child from understanding what has been said. Use of abstract language, and by this we mean sarcasm, idioms like, oh, it's raining cats and dogs, or pull up your socks, or metaphors. They're dysregulated, so whether that's emotionally dysregulated, sensory dysregulated, dysregulation can really affect someone's ability to understand what someone has said to them. And it's important that we look into that. I know a later seminar, a later webinar for you to access will be looking at emotional dysregulation and also sensory strategies as well. So that might be really helpful for you to go to. And the language level might just be too high for them. And poor receptive language will impact on how words are stored in the long-term memory, which can affect expressive language, but also literacy development as well. So blanks levels of questioning. This is a framework that you may have heard of school. I know speech and language therapists use it quite a lot, and we use it as part of our assessment, but also part of therapy as well. And that separates different types of questions and directions into 4 levels. And it was developed by Marion Blank, a developmental psychologist, to provide a more structured approach to oral language comprehension testing in children. And this is just a brief overview of the 4 different levels, from naming to describing, retelling, and justifying. So we can talk about this more later on. So strategies to consider when we look at comprehension. Consider the teaching environment. Think about what are the environmental difficulties that might be impacting a child's understanding, but also think of maybe the sensory impact of different things. Is it too noisy? Is it too cold? Working in a group for one child may not be the best, but maybe individual one-to-one with a teacher would be better. Breaking down instructions into short, manageable chunks, emphasizing keywords in the instruction. Allowing extra time for the child to listen and process the language. So try counting to 10 seconds after you give an instruction before you speak again. We as speech and language therapists like to use this, we like to call this a 10-second rule. Allow 10 seconds, because that 10 seconds might just be enough time for the child to respond. And sometimes it might be even more than 10 seconds. Sometimes it might be up to a minute. And I know that seems like a very long time waiting for a child to respond, but sometimes you just need that length of time to fully understand what has been said. Because if you've asked a question, your time starts with the child, but it hasn't reached around maybe 30 seconds down here, what they need to be able to process. So as it goes past maybe 10 seconds, and you ask another question, it resets their clock. So allowing for the whole time will really, really help them to process the language. And it will vary between each child who you work with. Mind maps may be helpful for some children to break down the instructions, what they need to do. Explaining ambiguous language and idioms. Don't assume that they always understand what you mean. Narrative structures can help with story comprehension. So visual cues like who, where, when, what happened in terms of that comprehension. And support with your saying using visual cues, gestures, diagrams, pictures, and also visual timetables, and I'll show you on the next slide, may be really helpful for the children to support them to understand of what will be happening during the session that you're having the intervention, or just what's happening generally in the classroom too. So this is an example. So the first one here, we have got first and then, or a now and next board, and this is just 3 different activities that will be happening, but you might have a range, and it might even be more simplistic than that. It could just be on a whiteboard. And here are 2 different visual timetables, one going down and then one that's been created through online widget as well. So narrative skills. So narrative involves being able to describe an account of events or the way we tell a story. And this skill can either be spoken or written. And those children who have difficulties will often have difficulty with both written and verbal or oral narrative. So narrative helps us to understand events that have just occurred so we can think logically about what has happened before the event, and to allow us to predict what might happen after the event. And this can guide us to shape the actions we take. Therefore, narrative acts as a social skill to interact with others, a defence skill as we can explain ourselves and logically think about the actions we are taking. And it is a skill that educates us and others. And narrative skills tend to develop around the age of 3, as other language skills start to develop as well. And children begin to develop their narrative skills as they start to understand other people's stories and show awareness of how events link with one another. And by the age of 7 to 8, a child should have developed mature narrative skills and will be able to tell a logical story without missing any important information. And narrative is an important part of spoken language, as it allows us to understand what the child is saying and for a child to fully express themselves. So narrative is such an important skill for both to speak verbally, but also when we move on to later, when we move on to the written narrative as we progress through school. It's such an important skill. And this is just a pack that I use here at my school, and it's Black Sheep Press. You may have heard of it. I know speech and language therapists use these resources widely. They provide resources for speech sounds as well as language comprehension and also narrative as well. And this pack is just supporting children at Key Stage 2 age to move on from verbal or oral narrative to be able to write a narrative. So this is a really good resource, and you can buy this from their website as well if you just type in Black Sheep Press. It's a really good resource to use. And my next slide here, there are different resources. Here are just a few. There are many I could show you, which support speech, language and narrative development that will also then help with later literacy development too. So here we've got Black Sheep Press. We've got Word Aware, which I touched on in vocabulary. So you've got one teaching vocabulary across the day and across the curriculum, teaching vocabulary in the early years, and teaching vocabulary in small groups for ages 6 to 11. So these resources are amazing, and I always talk about them within schools when I was working in community and also with Witherslack group. And I really highly recommend you buying and purchasing these resources because they're a great whole school approach that you can use to support children with their vocabulary learning. And there are really, really fun activities which kids love to engage in. And then we've got LCLAN, which some TAs and teaching assistants, higher level teaching assistants and teachers may have already been trained in. But these provide language builders just to support the development of children's language. So you've got 3 to 5s, 5 to 11s, and 11 to 16s there. And it's just want to know that these obviously are suggestions that I'm making. They've been used, I've used them personally to work with both neurotypical and those children who are neurodivergent. And I always tend to use a trial and error approach. I might go in with a Black Sheep Press resource thinking, oh, this is going to really work with a child. It may not, because they may say, I don't like this isn't working for me. And that's okay, because it's all part of talking with them, finding what works best for them, and then using the resources that they prefer to help them. Like I mentioned with colourful semantics, child might really prefer that and want to use that with elements to say shape coding, but not use shape coding because they prefer the coloured structure of the colourful semantics. So it's just important to talk to the young people, find out what works best for them and find different ways to support them. And you can obviously always talk to speech and language therapists because we're more than happy to help you. And by listening to what young people are wanting and what would help them, this also, it doesn't shows that we're listening to them, we're embracing what works for them in terms of their neurodiversity, but it also supports them to become self-advocates for themselves as well. So, oh, sorry, I'm not sure why these come in the wrong order. But strategies for narrative would be consider the teaching environment, reduce background noise again, read aloud frequently, narrative structures to help story comprehension, which we mentioned in the previous section, provide sentence starters or questions to help children structure their narratives, provide and use pictures, objects, or drawings to help children remember and retell their stories. And encourage children to tell their own stories, provide prompts or start a sentence with, oh, like once upon a time, just to get them started. And see, some of the prompts we use might be even more than that, like thinking the who, the where, who, what, where, why, and things like that, which are all part of the Black Sheep Press that I mentioned. I know that was a whistle-stop tour. There's probably a lot of information I've given you there. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you, Amy. There's so much information there, like you said. So we'll be sending out the presentation recording to everyone so they can catch up on that in their own time and look at all the amazing resources you've recommended as well. So thank you. We've had loads of questions coming in, so I'll try and get through as many as we can. The first one is, how do you balance neuroaffirming practices with speech and language therapy? For example, how do you support social communication without making students mask and become more neurotypical?
Yeah. So this is something we're definitely working here at my school at the moment. We're trying to be as neuroaffirming as possible. In my old job, I was always, when I was diagnosing children with autism, I always wanted to talk more to children about their preferences. I wanted to know what works for them, and whether that's like by eye contact I mentioned earlier, whether they prefer, say, to join in conversations once someone else has started them, or whether they're happy to initiate conversations. And at my school now, we're starting to create, and I know other schools within Witherslack have already got them, communication passports. So we're creating them to talk about what are the children's strengths, what are their needs, what help them, what do they like to do in terms of their social communication, what do they prefer. And we then have these, and we regularly will start to update them every few months or even every half term, because things are always changing. Because with autism, and just specifying one specific neurodivergence, autism is a very dynamic condition. So things that the child might find difficult when they're younger may be very different from when they're early secondary school or later on as a teenager, and then continue into that adult life. It will constantly be changing. So these preferences will change as well, and they need to be reviewed. And these passports will then move on between the different classes as they progress. And we talk to the children, they're more than happy to do this because they know that this is them and this is the important information that they teachers need to know to support them. And for in terms of social communication as well, there is a new project that's just come out called Leans, and it's available through Glasgow University. I can always share the link, and I can make see if Molly can send it around to everyone. So it's about learning about neurodiversity within the classroom, and there's pre-planned sessions, and you can talk about neurodiversity, about understanding other social communication preferences as well. And it's just a really, really good tool to use with the children.
Yeah, that's brilliant. If you send me that link, Amy, I'll send that out tomorrow. That would be brilliant. Thank you. The next question is, I have a child in my class. She's 11 years old and has a diagnosis of ASD. Her vocabulary is very good and she's meeting expected outcomes in most areas. However, she really struggles spelling simple words. She's been tested for dyslexia, which she doesn't appear to have. I wondered how I can support her with this.
Okay. Well, the example of the NIPA, so there's the NIPA, which is the Newcastle Intervention for Phonological Awareness. There is also the NAPA, and which is the Newcastle Assessment for Phonological Awareness. It's on the same website, so you can still access it there. But this is a really good tool that, and it doesn't specify that speech and language how to do it. So TAs and teachers can use it. So it might be worth just doing bits of those assessments, especially maybe looking at the identifying the first sound, first sound, last sound, and segmenting, because that might be a really good start to help them with their spelling later on. Spelling obviously isn't a particular area of speech and language therapy, but targeting phonological awareness might be the first step to go, and I would recommend an app for that.
Yeah, that's great. And there's a lady called Amy in the chat who's just sent a link to that as well, Lean. So that's brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's great.
The next question is a year six, if a year six has not learned phonics, is it possible to catch up with intervention?
So we've got lots of children here at school which and they're in their teenagers, and they may be struggling still with the reading and writing. There is always possibility that children will learn their phonics and will be able to access those skills. It just depends on the factors as well, like their cognitive abilities. If their cognitive levels maybe are lower, they may not be able to progress further than that, because that's just what they're able to do. So there's lots of factors to consider. But it's always worth, if phonics hasn't worked, then try maybe the early phonological skills that we mentioned earlier, and going that route and accessing support from teachers as well in terms of the phonological area, phonics resources, and there might be specialist teachers. And also possibly go down the route, is it dyslexia as well? Is it not just a difficulty with phonics?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Amy. Next question is, do you believe it should be now and next, or first and then?
There is lots of debate about this. So I guess it really depends on what works best for the children. So, for example, I've got children who struggle with they don't understand the concept of what's first and last. So now and next works for them. So it really varies, and I don't think there's a right or wrong way of saying, oh, now and next, or first and last, or first, next, last. I think just figure out what works best for the children, what do they prefer, and then you're considering their preferences, and then that just helps with the whole neurophonic practice as well.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you, Amy. The next question is, do you have any strategies to work with PDA or demand avoidant children?
Okay, yeah. So in terms of PDA, so in terms of the autism diagnosis, we no longer diagnose children with PDA, so pathological demand avoidance. For those people who don't know what PDA means, we would just say now that a child has autism with maybe features of possible demand avoidance. There is the PDA charity, and they have lots of resources online on their website, which are really good to access. And I will have a look later on after this conference, and I will send Molly some more resources so they can be sent across to you as well for the resources.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Amy. The next question is, I have a young person with excellent vocabulary and reading skills, but struggles to transfer this to writing and spelling. What can I do to help this?
So they have all those vocabulary, but it's just so in terms of with the vocabulary, is it in terms of when you say about the writing, is it difficulty putting those words into written sentences? Is it more of the narrative? If it's say more of the narrative, like the oral to written narrative pack might be really good, because that's kind of looking at some of the aspects of vocabulary, but also linking into that sentence structure too. So thinking about those words, putting into the sentence structure, like the subject, like so the who in terms of that narrative, what are they doing, where are they going, why are they going, or but obviously going into those more later narrative, like what is the problem, what is the solution. So that might be a really good pack to use for that.
Brilliant, thank you, Amy. And just time for one last question. What's your opinion on music to learn language?
Music to learn language. That's something I haven't necessarily done myself, but I can say for syllable clapping, when we did phonological awareness, in some of my sessions I do get a drum out, and we'll rather than clapping, we do bang on drums, or we'll play a triangle, and it's just a different creative way of learning language. We find if we're thinking about learning language, like for those who stammer, they find actually singing a lot easier, because there's less pressure on the actual words. They'll have those words but learning, but maybe thinking of like if there's songs that you can think of to learn new words, it's a different way of trying to learn new words, and sometimes those different experiences work well for some children. I think it's just finding out what works for some children or what works for your class, and trying trial and error, just like I say, because you never know if this one strategy will work for the whole class. It might work for some children, but if you're trying to find like a whole strategy, it's definitely worth having a go. If it works, then amazing. If it doesn't work, what elements can we use to support the whole class later on? So it's all about trial and error with different strategies.